Hello, historians, and welcome back. Today we are discussing a very long period in Arizona history called Territorial Arizona. And really, this is a fascinating time in American history and Arizona history because we're spanning about 100 years or so, the better part of 100 years. And so there's a lot of ways to look at this. We could look at it as Arizona under Spanish rule, under Mexican rule, and ultimately under American rule. So because of that, this is a fairly lengthy lecture, maybe the longest we'll have all semester long. So I encourage you to budget your time, take breaks if you need to, give yourself some time to go and come back. But you're also welcome to complete the challenge as you're watching the lecture. Sometimes I find it's good to toggle or kind of use the lecture happening in one tab and then go to another tab while you're completing the challenge. So as always, I'm your host, Dr. Summer Cherland, and let's get started. Now, when we look at the Arizona territorial period, you might have noticed that I have a date range here from 1821 to 1912. Really, that date even can be debatable, and I hope that you'll see by the end of today's lecture kind of why I chose that date 1821 instead of, say, 1861 or 1863. For me, I believe the Arizona territorial period begins with Mexican control over Arizona, what is today's Arizona. So let's talk a little bit about that. Here's the backdrop. So Spanish holdings in the New World, what they called the New World, were really declining by the late 1700s, so by the late 18th century. And a lot of this has to do with things that have nothing to do with the Southwest or Central America or South America. A lot of these things have to do with global tension happening all the way across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe. So here are some things that are going on. You have the French Revolution, which is very much inspired by the American Revolution in the late 18th century. As a result, you have the Napoleonic Wars, which are a series of conflicts in Europe, really at kind of the feet of France. And then you have the defeat of Napoleon in the end. I would say probably early 1800s, 1815 or so. And then the next thing that happens that really affects European colonial holdings is in 1823, the United States enacted the Monroe Doctrine. Now, what this was it was an international policy upheld by the United States and one of the first international policies that the US ever enacted that, for the most part, established that no more European colonial efforts would be tolerated in the Western Hemisphere. So this essentially closes European colonialization off from North America, South America, Central America, and sort of the surrounding islands. That really affects the way the United States, and in some parts Mexico, in some ways Mexico, are interacting with Europe from this point forward. And this also leads to a rise of kind of liberation movements, right? The United States has helped to sort of liberate the Western Hemisphere from European colonial holdings. And many of these liberation movements become kind of uprisings that are inspired by the French Revolution in places like South and Central America, but in particular in Mexico. And enter Mexican independence. So Mexico, as you might remember, won its independence from Spain in 1821. This led to an immediate removal of Spanish resources and a decline in Spanish power in places like Sonora, right, and what we call later Occidente, and throughout all of Mexico. Loyal Spaniards were either expelled or fled on their own accord back to Spain. And then Mexico really tried to oust anybody who is aligned with the Spanish crown. So Mexico, in its achievement of independence, decides that they're going to cut off all loyal ties from Spain to begin with and kind of start fresh, start their own. This includes Franciscan priests who were living throughout the Southwest in places like Tubac and Tucson, which you learned about recently. Even religious leaders were thrown out. They had to leave Mexican territory at this point. But independent Mexico, so they have a problem. Independent Mexico actually is not able to function like a colonial authority the way that Spain had been. They lacked structure to begin with. They lacked wealth and resources. And they really did try to kind of model after American colonial efforts to achieve independence. But really, they struggled to achieve stability. And that ultimately comes to shape the reality of Arizona and parts of New Mexico. So here's what Mexico does with their new holdings now that they have claimed the territories from Spain. One of the first things they do is they combine the old states of Sonora and Sinaloa into a new state, which they called Occidente. So up here in this dark green area, Interno de Occidente, this is all of mostly modern day Arizona, New Mexico, and Alta California. This is what Mexico is now calling Occidente. This includes anything in Arizona, particularly south of the Gila River and all of New Mexico. And there was no centralized government in Arizona. This is a territory that is, it doesn't look like the state we know, right? This is all encompassing this huge swath of space. The only European Mexican settlements at the time anyway in modern day Arizona would have been Tucson and Tubac. So it wouldn't have been like, you think about like Phoenix, Flagstaff, Wickenburg, Florence, like all those settlements that are north of the Gila River and then most of the Salt River, Prescott, right? Those places don't exist yet. So the center of life in today's present day Arizona would have really been aligned instead with New Mexican government and New Mexican authority, or even further south, Mexico City. So most settlers, though, at the time, if they moved into Occidente or they already were living there, they kind of immediately began withdrawing their cultural affiliation with Mexico City anyway. So they really stopped seeing themselves as part of the Mexican government, the Mexican culture, and they see themselves more as separate. Some of them called themselves Hispanos, right? Hispano, Hispanos. And these were people who tended to be aligned with New Mexico, Occidente, that area, and didn't really see themselves as Mexican. That really does make a difference when we start to look at kind of, border politics, border identity as it kind of evolved over the 20th and 19th centuries. So what was life like, or kind of where did we get kind of an American expansion spirit? So how does America begin to expand into Mexican holding of Occidente? American expansionism hit a fever pitch in the 1840s, but it started long before that. American movements to expand into the continental US really were there from the beginning. In fact, the Revolutionary War in many ways was fought over colonists' desires to move west of the Appalachian Mountains, but they weren't allowed to by the British Crown. And then in 1803, this is, not long after America establishes its own independence, Thomas Jefferson purchases like a ton of territory from France, which is what they called Louisiana at the time. And he basically took all of French holdings from North America south of the Canadian border, what today's Canadian border. But then you start to see other things that affect Mexican holdings of American expansion. We're going to see how American-sponsored or contested settlements in Texas in the mid-19th century actually guaranteed American encroachment. And that actually starts with trade. It begins with trade. So the Santa Fe Trail, which you can see here highlighted, El Camino Real, right? And here's Santa Fe. This is kind of marked all in red along here, connects the United States, the eastern United States, sort of in the Kansas, St. Louis area, those areas, all the way to the middle of the Southwest. It officially opened in 1821 as a trade route between Mexico and the United States. But it really is an older road, believe it or not. It was a trade route used by indigenous people for centuries before European arrival. But now in the 1820s, the Santa Fe Trail opens, and now there's an expressway. There's a way to get to the West instead of just kind of, finding your way through prairies and deserts and such. So traders, trappers, and explorers, some of whom we talked about recently, used the trail to head into today's Arizona, the mountains looking for riches. You might recognize some of these names. The most famous are Kit Carson, Jedediah Smith, James Ohio, Sylvester Patty. If you're kind of a history buff and you like learning about the Old West, you would recognize those names. But these guys were really, really prominent in early territorial Arizona. They were Army scouts during the Apache or Indian Wars. They named rivers and roads and trails and mountains and canyons all after themselves. But more importantly, they established kind of a new romanticism about expansion into the American West on behalf of the empire that was the United States. So American encroachment might be the same thing as expansionism, right? To expand is to expand an empire and spread out. Encroachment is to claim space or push into somebody else's space. And fueled by President Polk at the time, his expansionism, American fecundity, which is another word for fertility. Americans were able to populate faster in terms of territory at the time, and a national desire to annex as much territory between the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Pacific Ocean. Basically, from as early as 1803, Americans continually moved into what was then Spain and now Mexican held territories like Texas or Tejas, California, and New Mexico or Occidente. So what's motivating the colonists, or not the colonists, the Americans at the time to encroach on Mexican territory? What's causing them to be so invested in American expansionism? Well, you might have heard this term before in a previous history class, manifest destiny, okay? This first became known in the 1840s. It was a belief and a concept that was marketed by prospectors and politicians that kind of fueled American ambition for westward migration and westward expansion. Now, manifest destiny, it's really kind of a branding or an advertisement tool, and it was coined in 1845. It was an ideology that the United States is destined by God, right? Destined by like ultimate ordain, right? To conquer and expand using conquest, violence, or democracy across the entire North American continent. So this is, you're called by God, right? The entire country is called by God to settle into the Western territories and really expand Protestantism, democracy, and democratic politics throughout these, what they considered wild, savage lands. This drove 19th century US territorial expansion. Now, it's not the only thing. It's not like Americans just like took up the banner of manifest destiny. A lot of this was done through military, through warfare, through federal sponsored purchasing and sales of territorial lands. But what made it so popular was the idea that Americans were called by God. So the promotion, the branding of this movement is what manifest destiny is. It was truly used against Native Americans and in some cases Mexican nationals. It was used to sort of justify their forced removal. So their removal from places where there were their traditional homelands, but also violence and warfare. And it led to a very, very fast, within 20 years, rapid expansion of the United States, new states being added to the Union quickly, debates over the expansion of slavery, which is ultimately what led to the Civil War. And then what we'll talk about today, a war with Mexico. So the Mexican-American War, you know, it's not a very long war, but it is one of the most significant wars in American history. You might see it as the US-Mexican War, the Mexican War, or the Mexican-American War. You can use any one of those titles and I'll know what you're talking about. I just refer to whatever sources I'm using at the time. So the source I used for this lecture and the sources refer to it as the Mexican-American War. So how does the Mexican-American War start? How do America and Mexico end up at war? Now remember, Mexico doesn't have a ton of stability after they go to war with Spain. And that's just about 20 some years, 25 years prior to the US-Mexican War. So they're not in a great situation. And America knows that. So based on kind of who you talk to, the war is either a dispute between Mexico and the United States over where Texas is, or it's basically American encroachment into Mexican territory. It's kind of depending on who you talk to. So the Mexican government views it as an invasion of Mexico and Mexican-held territories by the United States. Now, I want to point out on the map sort of where we're talking about. So right here in this kind of peach tan territory, this is the disputed area. If you'll notice, that includes, or that is part of modern day Texas. So we might even do a little, circle so you kind of see where I'm talking about. So this is sort of modern day Texas, this pink circle I just designed or just created. Let's make that a different color so you can see it a little bit better. Maybe red. Yeah. Okay, so the precipitating incident is a boundary dispute between Mexico over a piece of land that is in modern day Texas called the Nueces Strip, which is named for the Nueces River. But really, it's all those things I just told you about. It's American expansionism, it's encroachment, it's manifest destiny. So look at Texas. I want you to think about Texas, and it's sort of similar to Occidente. Americans, Mexicans, and people who called themselves Tejanos, as well as indigenous people, had been living in modern day Texas for decades with some semblance of authority or autonomy. After Mexican independence, the newly established government in Mexico offered a deal to the people living in, what they called Tejas, okay? Including Americans, so Americans living in Texas. And what they said was you could live here independently if you're loyal to the Mexican government and you paid taxes. And the Tejanos were like, okay, fine, right? The people living there were like, okay, fine. But it didn't last long. So think about this. The Mexican independence is won in 1821. Texas, by 1835, goes to war for its independence. So it was not more than, it was 14 years of Texas being its own independent territory, united under Mexican government, when they go to war just for their own autonomy. But the war ended quickly, with Texas agreeing to maintain isolation from the United States. But then a year later, the United States just annexed Texas anyway. So kind of one of those things where you're like, huh, you agreed to not align yourselves with the United States, but ultimately the United States claims all of Texas, including this disputed territory. They believe that this is Texas. Texas believes this is Texas. Mexico believes this is their territory still. There we go. It's a new annotation tool. So here's where it begins. Like I said, the United States believes Texas is bigger than it is. Mexico believes that it is smaller than it is. And they see the US encroachment on a Mexican territory as a violation and a call to combat. So basically the war lasts for about 2 years. There's skirmishes on either side of the border. There's even a battle in Mexico City. And it ends in 1848 because the Mexican government simply cannot sustain the war effort. So there's two real consequences of the Mexican-American War. The first is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, this ends the war between the United States and Mexico, and it ends with Mexico ceding more than half of its North American territory, and that includes all of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of modern-day Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming. We are talking about a huge chunk of space that America wins after going to battle with Mexico over Texas. And then just a few years later, the American government purchases a space called the Gadsden Purchase. And you can see that is down here in this kind of orange section, everything south of the Gila River. And it's $10 million. It's a ton of money at the time that the United States pays for 29,670 miles in Arizona, south of the Gila River. So those are the two ultimate endings of the Mexican-American War, and they forever shape what we know as Arizona. Now, one of the books I used is by these guys, Garonsky and Dill, who wrote Arizona History and Government, an introduction, and they say Arizona, which I've identified here as this big circle, was not the prize. America wasn't looking to claim Arizona. They didn't care about Arizona. In fact, they had quite a bit of disdain for Arizona. Instead, what we know of as today Arizona was just a connecting part of the prized area. Now, the prized area was primarily Texas and California. All right, so what results as a result of the Mexican-American War, the Gadsden Purchase, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? First, Texas is admitted as a state in 1845, and then Oregon in 1846. Now, Oregon doesn't come from Mexico, but it's a whole movement, right? Manifest destiny, encroachment, expansion. Then California is admitted as a state in 1850 without even having to go through territorial status. They're just immediately admitted as a state, and that's because large amounts of gold are discovered in California in 1849. That's where the San Francisco 49ers, that's where they get their name, 49ers, right? Then New Mexico Territory is claimed in 1850. So it was called Occidente. The United States begins calling it New Mexico. And this increased with the Gadsden Purchase in 1854. And then Colorado Territory right here is claimed in 1859. And they're only a territory for a couple of years, and they become a state in 1861. So we're going to move on now. And finally, at the point where I promised you I'd talk about Arizona Territory. But if you need a break, this is a great time to pause, take a break, come back, because we've done the first half. And this next part is really about your challenge and understanding Arizona Territory. All right, welcome back. So now I have a new date on here, Arizona Territory, 1863 to 1912. Well, I'm about to give you just a couple more dates that will make it even more confusing for you. But before I do, let's talk about your challenge. So here's your challenge for this particular assignment. Don't get overwhelmed by the text. This stuff in gray here is intentionally kind of, grayed out a little bit. The first thing you're going to do is, as I go through the next portion of this lecture, which is all about the history of Arizona during its U.S. territorial history, you're going to select one topic of all the events, people, themes that I've talked about in this lecture, and you're going to examine it a little bit more. So those are everything there on the left that's kind of grayed out. Those are all examples of things I'm about to talk about, and you can choose from that list, or you can choose something else. The only real request I have is that you focus on everything from this point forward. So Arizona from 1860s on. I don't really want you to focus on anything I previously covered, including the Mexican period or Spain's decline. So really moving forward, any of these topics or other. Once you do that, you are going to use the Arizona Memory Project, which is an online digital collection managed by our Secretary of State of a bunch of historical photographs. And you're going to find one photograph that is relevant of your or about your selected topic. And when you're ready, you're going to share it with the class. When we get to the end of today's lecture, I'll walk you through an example. Okay, so Arizona Territory. It's actually a territory. It's got a territorial designation 3 times. This is wild. This does not happen, right? This is a very unique aspect of Arizona history. So here's the deal. When the United States conquers the Southwest from Mexico in the late 1840s, one of the things that is motivating this expansion is the concern over slavery. So the South, this is the 1860s, right? The Civil War is right around the corner, 1861, 1862, 1863. We're looking at Civil War, right? So part of what the Civil War is being fought over is the question of slavery, but it's a competition for wealth. At the time, it's hard to kind of imagine, but the South was incredibly powerful. The American South was one of the wealthiest places on earth, in part because of the cultivation of cotton. And cotton requires manual, physical, hard, enslaved person labor. So the South wants to expand its holdings further into places that can grow cotton. And guess what area has an excellent climate for growing cotton? We still have cotton fields everywhere around Phoenix. If you ever just drive around the outskirts of town, even throughout portions of South Phoenix, there are just random cotton fields. This is a wonderful place for growing cotton, and the South knew that. So they wanted to expand Southern territorial and state holdings into places like Arizona once the Mexican-American War was waged. Well, this becomes a problem because the United States, the Union, is the one that claims the authority and power over all of things like territorial expansion. And they're like, no, we're not going to let you expand slavery further west. So Arizona, okay, there's going to be an epic battle of wills. I just want you to look at this map. So we've kind of talked about the shape of Arizona. We'll look at it a little bit more later, but mostly this is kind of our bullseye. Do you see this black square and this gray space? So this is Arizona in the 1860s, not what you know of, which is more like a rectangle going vertically. We know of Arizona as that, right? But at the time in the 1860s, Arizona is actually this area that has like the claim, right? So it's the southern portion of New Mexico. Let me draw you a picture of where New Mexico is, and I'll give you a different color. Remember Occidente? And California's been admitted as a state at this point. That's probably too big. Let's see. Let's take that one off. This is New Mexico at the time, like right here, okay? And Arizona wants to be this like southern portion of the space. So if the union's not letting them be a territory, if the union's not letting them be a state yet, Arizona starts in 1861 by just declaring itself its own territory south from the south portion of New Mexico. And then the Confederacy, which is the southern states that have seceded from the Union, they actually claim Arizona territory in 1861, and they claim it for about a year. So the first official designation of Arizona as a territory is that it is a slave-holding territory. Okay, that is key to know. And in fact, you might find in the next couple days that Arizona's claim as its own territory in 1861 is actually its form of seceding from the Union. They actually seceded from the United States, wanting to join with the South. Well, then a couple years later, the United States or the Union claims the territory of Arizona because of a Civil War conflict. So did you know there were battles and Civil War waged in Arizona? In 1861, the United States received a petition from Arizona that asked for territorial status separate from New Mexico, and they were denied. Then the United States at that time viewed Arizona as a pro-slavery Southern territory, and the Union, of course, controlled territorial status. So this was a no for the territory of Arizona. So instead, Arizona becomes a military zone, as I said, for the Confederacy as soon as 1862. And at the time, this is the middle of the Civil War, the North and South are locked in a war over the future of slavery and its expansion west. But more importantly, both the Union and the South wanted access to gold in California, and Arizona provided an easy access, especially that strip by the Gadsden Purchase. So in trying to court Confederate support, Arizona began calling itself a territory as early as 1861, and that's that southern half of New Mexico, not the western half that we know of now today. And they applied to the Confederacy as a territory and were granted. So the territory of Arizona, that southern half, was established by the Confederacy in opposition to the Union. But then in response, the Union sent soldiers to Arizona, and they defeated a small band of Confederate scouts near Tucson. And later, the Union claimed Tucson and all of Arizona on behalf of the United States. So finally, a year later, President Lincoln signs the Organic Act of Arizona, making Arizona a territory finally in 1863. But it would take about 50 years. Remember, California was admitted without ever being a territory. It was admitted as a state. I think Colorado was like 2 or 3 years. It took nearly 50 years for the territory of Arizona to become a state. What in the world took so long? All right, let's talk about some of the people leading the charge in territorial history, and maybe we'll start to see what's going on, why Arizona statehood is eluding people of Arizona. Now, who runs the show? If Arizona is a territory, great. But how do we actually run a territorial government? So here's kind of how it functions. States and territories are very different. Territories are federally held lands that are functioning as kind of at the behest of the president or behest of the federal government. So territories are set up to operate as connected to the federal government, but not autonomous as states. And basically the president gets to appoint the leaders. The president gets to decide at his own sort of will who he wants to run the show. And actually, President Lincoln didn't have a ton of interest in Arizona. The only person he actually chose as a leader was this guy, Charles E. Poston, who took to calling himself the father of Arizona. And he was established as the lead of Native American affairs in Arizona. But he really affects the future of Arizona in a couple ways. The first thing he does is he helps get John Gurley appointed governor. So Gurley was an Ohio congressman and a Union colonel during the Civil War, but he died of appendicitis before he ever actually became the Arizona governor, or before he ever like really settled in Arizona. So he's the first governor of Arizona, but like not really. Instead, this guy gets appointed, John N. Goodwin. He is of Maine. So you can see, like, these aren't people who like live in Arizona. These are legislators and military officials and friends of the president who are most likely Northeasterners at the time, because the Union is favoring people from the North to run things like territorial government. So John Goodwin of Maine becomes the governor. And as an ardent anti-slavery politician, his goal is to punish Tucson, punish the southern portion of Arizona for trying to align itself with the Confederate cause. And this effectively changes the course of territorial and Arizona history from this point forward. He helps to basically oust Tucson's power and authority almost immediately. So let's talk a little bit about some of the more colorful chapters in territorial history. Now, much of the stuff I'm going to tell you about is well documented and corroborated, but some of the stories are a little bit mythical, all right? So they might be a little bit more fun than rooted in, hard fact. Okay, so did you know that Tucson, which is called the Old Pueblo, was the first territorial capital of Arizona? And that Arizona's capital actually changed 4 times before it became Phoenix. We take for granted that Phoenix is the capital, but it actually wasn't for the first 20 or so years, maybe more, of the state and territory's history. So the first state capital, I'm going to read to you from a guy named Luke Bate from the Arizona State Capitol Museum. The first state capital of Arizona really depends on which side you were on in the Civil War. Tucson is if you're on the Confederate side, and that is the first capital of Arizona. So this was in 1862 when the Arizona Territory was stacked horizontally with New Mexico, and it seceded from the Union to join the Confederate cause. Not all too happy about this, the federal government, the Union, instead created a new territory of Arizona, making a boundary line that is running vertical west and east instead of horizontal north and south. Then in 1864, the United States named Prescott as the capital, not Tucson. So throughout the Civil War, this is all happening during the Civil War, there are essentially 2 capitals. There's the Confederate capital, Tucson, and the Union capital, Prescott. They're 2 different Arizonas. There's the southern chunk of New Mexico, which is Confederate, and the western chunk of New Mexico, which is the Union, and they're overlapping, right? They're overlapping. So by 1867, the capital moves back to Tucson once the territory is fully established. And that's partly because it's just a better city with more resources. Prescott was a little bit more isolated. But like I said, John Goodwin is really out to get Tucson. So there's a lot of back and forth. Now look at Prescott. Prescott's the capital from 1864 to 1867, and then again in 1887 until 1889. How does that happen? The U.S. government establishes Prescott as the capital in 1864. Much of this was done because of Goodwin's influence, because he's looking to punish Tucson. Prescott was nestled in the nearby Bradshaw Mountains, where they had discovered some small deposits of gold. So it was also like a fairly wealthy, it was like a gold rush town. And they had a connection to Flagstaff, which was an emerging railroad and lumber enterprise. The capital then moves back and forth over the course of the next 30 years, but the final straw, right? The final straw that gets the capital to Prescott from Tucson until Phoenix takes over is something that state historian and storyteller Marshall Trimble used to tell about the thieving 13th. So I will be borrowing from Dr. Trimble, or Mr. Trimble's, Professor Trimble's stories here. So here's how it goes. All right, Trimble's version of how Prescott became the capital in the late 1880s goes something like this. He calls the story the Thieving 13th. Now, this is one of the most interesting sessions in Arizona territorial history. This is the 13th legislature meeting in Prescott in 1885. That year, the citizens of Tucson raised a bunch of money and told their delegates to go to the legislative session and bring back the capital. They wanted nothing else, bring back the capital to Tucson. But other delegates were jockeying for other things. Now, delegates are usually county officials, so you'll hear some county titles. Pinal County wanted a bridge across the Gila River. That's really the southern kind of where Tucson is, but also a little bit further east, I believe. Cochise County wanted to secede from the territory altogether. They didn't even want to be in Arizona. Maricopa, that's where Phoenix is, wanted a normal school, which is a university for teachers. And Tucson and Prescott were both vying for the capital. Well, Mother Nature, as she often does, intervened with a flood on the Salt River, which meant that the Tucson delegates, the southern delegates, had to actually go all the way out to Los Angeles and then ride a train to Ashford, which is about, 50 miles from Prescott. And then they had to ride a stagecoach into Prescott. Just imagine, right? The commitment you'd have to go through to get to the legislative session. So they were planning to take the stagecoach back to the capital, Prescott, but a snowstorm then stops them in their tracks in Hell's Canyon. So one of the delegates, a guy named Bob Leatherford, who's like really well known in Arizona history, he takes a satchel of money and rides a mule into town. Well, he's late. Leatherford doesn't get there in time, and all the political trades had been made and prizes handed out. Prescott remained the capital. Cochise was stuck in the territory. They're not allowed to secede. Phoenix gets its asylum. They wanted a university for teachers and an insane asylum. And a bridge was approved for Florence. And then Tempe got the normal school. So Phoenix gets the asylum, and then nearby Tempe gets the normal school, which becomes Arizona State University. Well, Tucson delegates realized in horror that they had lost everything. They didn't have any successful bids for anything, but there was one thing left on the table. This was the time when the federal government was sort of giving out grants, large portions of money for territories to establish universities. And no one in Arizona wanted the university, apparently. So the federal government had this money sitting on the table, and Tucson was like, I guess we'll take it. Leatherford's not happy. Leatherford was like, who the hell, that's what he said, according to Trimble, who the hell wants a university? When they returned to Tucson, their constituents were infuriated. No one wanted a university. And instead, they had wanted the capital and nothing else. So the tale of the story is that they began hurling like eggs, bread, rocks, tomatoes, all at their elected officials when they found out what had happened. And one person apparently threw a dead cat. And that is the tale of how Tucson lost the capital for good. Well, how in the world does Phoenix become the capital then, right? How do we get from 1885-ish to where it's at Prescott? How do we get to Phoenix? Let me tell you a little bit about Phoenix. And for the remainder of today's class, we're really going to be focusing on Phoenix history. So again, if you want to take a little break, this might be a good time. All right, so how does Phoenix get into the mix? So far, Phoenix has not been mentioned, right? That's because it didn't exist. Throughout the 19th century, the major settlements were Tucson, Prescott, and Wickenburg. In the 1880s, Mexican and white prospectors began carving out irrigation ditches along the banks of the Salt River using the fossilized remnants of canals that had been dug by the Hohokam. You might recognize the Hohokam, you might recognize the Salt River, right? These things might start to become a little familiar for you. These canals helped to bring and control water in an area that until then had been fairly undeveloped by white settlers. People in Tucson, Prescott, and Wickenburg actually called what was now Phoenix way out east. And so how did it become the capital city? How does it, because the capital city is typically fairly powerful. So how does Phoenix, way out east, this little, cow town, become the capital? Well, let's turn to Marshall Trimble again. So Marshall Trimble wrote this book, Arizona Cavalcade of History, and he's known as the state historian. He's also a master storyteller. This is the story of Kissin Jenny, according to Marshall Trimble. Now, the 15th legislator, so 2 years later, or two legislatures later, met in 1889 again in Prescott. Once again, the capital is up for grabs. And a recent upstart city on the banks of the Salt River, Phoenix, was making a play. But they lacked any political cachet. They lacked a lot of resources to really make it happen. So, according to Trimble, the Maricopa County, remember, legislatures are typically by county, so Phoenix, right? The Maricopa County delegates went about it in kind of a nefarious way. They made a deal with a certain lady of the evening in Prescott on Whiskey Row, a woman by the name of Jenny, or she's also known to history as Kissin' Jenny. Apparently, one of the more powerful Yavapai County delegates, Prescott, was a customer of Jenny's. This legislator wore a glass eye. Now, this is 1889 in a dusty desert territory of Arizona. A glass eye would have been a symbol of great wealth. It would have been very unique and very expensive. And this man was apparently really proud of his glass eye. He was very vain. The Maricopa delegates apparently bribed Jenny to detain the Yavapai delegate on the morning of the capital city vote. So here's what happens. The Yavapai delegate, this man with the glass eye, spent the evening in Jenny's company. As the two were about to fall asleep, he placed his glass eye in a water glass next to the bed to keep it safe and from drying out. As he fell asleep, Jenny drank the glass of water, eye and all. When he woke up on the morning of the vote, the man couldn't find his glass eye. He flipped out and refused to go anywhere in public without his eye, including the meeting of the legislators. His fellow delegates panicked because without him there to cast his vote, Prescott could very well lose the capital. So they ran to Jenny's place looking for their friend. They knew he'd probably be with Jenny. When they discovered what happened, they tried to force Jenny to produce the eye. Now, read into that what you will, but she couldn't or wouldn't do that. And in their panic, all of the delegates actually missed the capital vote and lost Prescott, the capital, for good. And Phoenix emerged victorious. Now, most records don't really corroborate the story. Most historians instead kind of believe that the capital was moved as a way to appease both Tucson and Prescott. It was sort of central. They had more resources. There was a railroad coming. Like, there's a variety of things that made Phoenix attractive. It's on the banks of the Salt. It's got access to the Gila, right? But the capital city, which had just been founded a few years prior, was about to emerge as one of the largest and most powerful centers of action, commerce, economy, population in the entirety of the American West. But it remains a territorial capital for a really long period of time in a territory that was a territory for like 60 years before becoming a state. So Arizona tries desperately to become a state, and it still takes a really long time. Okay, I've told you a little bit about the political history of Arizona as a territory. Let's talk about life in the territories. Now, remember, as part of your challenge, you're allowed to choose any of these topics that I'm discussing today and research them a little bit further. So what I want to do as I talk to you about the territorial life in Arizona is give you kind of 4 short stories about different people or groups living in Arizona territory at the time. I'm going to start with Jesus Leopold Otero. Now, I don't have a picture of Otero. I do, in fact, though, have a picture of a church that he was foundational in building and designing, and his legacy is left here at this church. So I wrote these stories. These are based on my own independent research, but I also have links to them if you want the stories themselves. In 1848, Jesus Leopold Otero became a U.S. citizen under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This Sonoran teen likely already lived in what is now Arizona territory at the time. Otero spent much of his youth learning to ranch in the border town of Yuma before moving to Phoenix to run a successful cattle enterprise. He built a house at Montezuma and Washington Street, which is basically the smack dab in the middle of today's downtown. It was in the middle of the new town site established in 1871, only a year after Phoenix lots became for sale. He was one of only 240 people living in Phoenix at the time, and 124 of them were Mexican. In the years to come, Otero would be at the epicenter of his new home's evolution from its emergent roots to state dominance. He, over his lifetime, saw this city grow, street names change, and new policies put into place to restrict non-white residents from full participation. So the center of activity of business and social was Washington Street, right where Otero lived. He operated a successful butcher shop and other enterprises. His home and businesses endeared him to the community, many of whom were Mexican. Like Otero, most were Catholic and they had no place to worship. There was no church here. So in 1872, Otero began opening his home to fellow worshipers. So they started worshiping in Catholicism in his private home. For the next 8 years, services were held at Otero's house whenever priests from Florence could make the trek. But they needed a permanent church. They needed a place in the settlement. So Otero and one of those priests from Florence, a guy by the name of Father Edward Gerard, along with 2 additional businessmen, Miguel Peralta and Paolo Parazzo, these 4 guys secured a plot of land on Monroe Street between Pima, which is now 3rd, and Pinal, which is now 4th streets. So right downtown. If you go downtown, you will see this church. Under Father Gerard's leadership, residents, mostly Mexican, built the impressive La Inmaculada Concepción de María, or St. Mary's Church, which opened in 1881. With final flourish, Otero donated furnishings from his own private collection to outfit the church. So furniture, artwork, etc. St. Mary's was only the second church in Phoenix and the only Catholic church in the city until 1924. And in building it with their own hands, Phoenix's Mexican community, quote, created their own social and cultural life around family activities at home and religious services, which led to a distinct sense of ethnic identity and cultural awareness on Monroe Street. However, unlike Jesus Leopold Otero, who was one of the first permanent residents in the township of Phoenix, many new Mexican residents were not given the choice as to where to live. So while he could live right downtown, Mexican new arrivals were day laborers, and they helped carve out the city's irrigation ditches. They helped to harvest crops on the surrounding farms, and very few had financial resources to rival Otero, and they all faced racist housing and labor restrictions. This then funneled them to Monroe Street and south. Monroe Street became home to both St. Mary's, but also a Mexican tenement district, a barrio, which spanned 2 city blocks on East Monroe. This was the late 1880s, and a spirit of xenophobia, which is hatred for other people based on their race if it's different from your own, was sweeping American whites across the nation. America was becoming even more diverse, with immigration from China and Eastern Europe, moving more people into the United States. These folks are drawn by everything that draws immigrants, right? The promise of a better life, reliable jobs, religious freedom, room to spread out. And Arizona, like many Western places, became home to white settlers who brought with them kind of published and intentional campaigns to ridicule and reject anyone who wasn't Anglo. The press, the newspapers, used really harsh language to persecute Mexican tenants in the East Monroe barrio, calling them greasers and blaming them for all, quote, manner of filth, which was common in places like Los Angeles, Denver, and throughout the Southwest. But all we have to do is consider city records, right? All we have to do is look at city council records to realize that white-led city officials, because those are the majority of the people sitting on the city council, they're choosing not to finance public services in neighborhoods that aren't white. So places like the East Monroe barrio are denied things like sidewalks or plumbing, but not because they chose to, because the city wouldn't fund them. So Jesus Leopold Otero navigated this environment of open racism and disdain for Mexican people, but he thrived as one of the earliest settlers in Phoenix. When he died in 1901, he left behind a city that was unrecognizable to him. In the 30 years following his purchase on the plot of Montezuma, which is now 1st Street and Washington, Phoenix had changed. The population exploded from 240 people in 1870 to over 5,500 residents in 1900. In his first year in Phoenix, Otero had been part of a Mexican population that made up half the city's demographic. By 1900, Mexicans only accounted for 14%. Boosterism, or branding and promotion, development, and the promise of the West drew wealthy Anglos to the Valley of the Sun. Phoenix became the territorial capital in 1889, but not without conflict. White Phoenicians angling for control of the territory used political strategies, managerial racism, and exclusion in order to call favor for their new city. And as this happened, Mexican and Native people lost agency and political influence in the years leading up to statehood. Mexicans were increasingly forced into less control or autonomy. In fact, some of those cities that were originally named for Arizona's tribes, they were stripped of their identity and renamed numerically. Both groups, Native and Mexican, were segregated from public services. And then even St. Mary's Church, La Inmaculada, right? This was designed, created, and built by Mexican ingenuity. It was stolen from its own founders when white Catholics took over the church and first began segregating the services. English only was conducted in the sanctuary, and anybody wanting the Latin or Spanish services had to take those services in the basement. And then ultimately, they segregated the congregation altogether. And so Mexican laborers ended up building another church just across the street because they were ousted from their own St. Mary's. So this is how in the final territorial and early statehood days, white newcomers took calculated measures to further isolate people of color into areas, quote, down there, into what we become to see as the emerging South Phoenix. So Jesus Leopold Otero, one of the founding fathers of Phoenix. Let's talk about one of the founding mothers, Trinidad Escalante Swilling. Now, would you believe it if I told you that the mother of Phoenix, Trinidad Escalante, was originally born in Hermosillo, Mexico, rather, and later became a U.S. citizen under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Trinidad was born in 1847 in today's Mexico. Her father died young, and her mother took Trinidad with her to a small settlement in the northern frontier, a little town called Tucson, the old Pueblo. Only 44 women were recorded at the time, and Trinidad and her mother would have been among them. When America took ownership of the southern parts of today's Arizona, but then New Mexico in 1854 under the Gadsden Purchase, Trinidad, her mother, and others living in Tucson became U.S. citizens. She would have been about 7. Around 10 years later, Trinidad met and fell in love with a rambler named Jack Swilling. They married in 1864, and Jack knew the area. He was a Confederate soldier. He had defected from the Confederacy and moved into New Mexico territory in the 1860s. After they married, the two moved to Wickenburg, where Jack tried and failed at mining. They then moved south toward the Gila and Salt Rivers after Jack had visited a friend who was farming hay for Camp McDowell. Now, the friend used old irrigation ditches that were inspired by the Hohokam and ultimately inspired the enterprising Jack. The U.S. had established Camp McDowell in 1865 as an army post to protect the military engagements and residents of Prescott, Wickenburg, and other central Arizona settlements from what they called hostile Indians. And life in Camp McDowell was very tough. The harsh desert made farming for food sources really difficult. And essentially, it was challenging to kind of survive until they found a source of water. But the Salt River was erratic at the time. It seemed that no one knew how to predict or tame the river's wild cycles of flooding and drought. So after a fateful trip of visiting his friend at Camp McDowell, Jack began prospecting for ancient canal ruins a little further south of Camp McDowell, and he probably didn't do it alone. Most likely Trinidad or friends would have helped him. Trinidad, his wife, had grown up among Native and Mexican people, and they had lived in New Mexico and Arizona territories for generations. So they would have known where these canals were, and they likely knew who the Hohokam were and what the canals had been used for. So sure enough, the story goes that Jack sort of happened upon some canals, buried ditches on the north bank of the Salt River in 1867. And archaeologists believe that the Hohokam, the original dwellers of the Salt River Valley, managed to farm the desert by irrigating and taming these rivers and waters through canal systems anywhere from 2000 BC to about 1200 AD. Today, the exact location of Jack's original sighting is unclear, though many place it near Phoenix's Pueblo Grande or Sudovaki Museum near Sky Harbor Airport. But Jack and Trinidad got right to work. They incorporated the Swilling Irrigation and Canal Company, and they hired 16 American and Mexican miners, farmers, and laborers to begin carving out these irrigation ditches. They used the fossilized remains of the Hohokam canals. They began farming and laying out plans for a new township on the north banks of the Salt River. And white settlers called this town Phoenix. Now, this is after a myth of a bird that emerges from the ashes of a dead city. So the city was the bird, the ashes of the ancient canals of the Hohokam. So if Jack Swilling is a father of Phoenix, Trinidad Escalante was most certainly the mother, and here's how. Founders of the township, Trinidad and Jack, were among the very first residents of Phoenix. Trinidad moved their children from Wickenburg to a small ranch near the Hohokam Canal. Their home they called Dos Casas. It was located at today's 36th Street and Washington, and it was the city's first homestead, making Trinidad the very first woman to live in Phoenix. She was also one of the first Mexican residents in the city. And Trinidad was more than Jack Swilling's wife, in part because she was vital to the way the city's society evolved. Her home became a meeting ground for political and religious endeavors. She welcomed Mexican and Catholic newcomers to her home for worship before the church was constructed down the way. And then when Jack died in Yuma Territorial Prison in 1878, Trinidad was still fairly young and living on a ranch in a frontier town that she had helped to start, but she was on her own. She continued to thrive, though, as the center of Phoenix society. The first city elections in Phoenix were held in her home. She taught school at St. Mary's Church. You learned about the church just a minute ago, and she worked as a seamstress. She basically built the community around herself. Trinidad lived for a long time. She died in 1925 and was placed in an unmarked grave at St. Francis Cemetery in Phoenix next to her son, Charles. Her grave went without any headstone in 1997. But today, you can find her grave beneath a simple marker that reads Trinidad Swilling Shoemaker, thanks to cemetery officials who donated about $200 to have a gravestone properly marked. So scholars for a long time claimed that Phoenix was a city founded by whites for whites. And we will see for sure that racial housing and employment restrictions existed from the very beginning of this city. They were first written in 1888, long before Arizona was even a state. So, but how do we contend with this claim of whiteness when our first homesteader was a Sonoran woman who became an American citizen under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Further, Native American and Mexican people, either nationals or formal US citizens, lived along the Salt River long before these white farmers of Phoenix claimed the area for themselves. And Trinidad's tale tells us there's more to the story of Phoenix and more to the way we understand the founding fathers and mothers than we may readily realize. What about beyond Phoenix? What about places outside of the city center? Here's a chapter in Arizona territorial history and American history that can elicit quite a response from students. Have you ever been driving on or past Indian School Road in Phoenix? Have you ever wondered how it got its name? So Arizona's territorial period lasted from around 1861 to 1912, which actually dovetailed with a federal initiative to control and dominate America's native people. Through murder, coercion, fear, relocation, and education, the federal government sought to either obliterate or Americanize Native people. And one of the ways they did this was through forced schooling. Native children across the United States were forced into boarding schools, off-site, live-in schools very far away from their families. I just want you to picture being a little kid and going through something like that. Using abuse and very harsh methods, American educators forced Native children, as those pictured here, to adopt American speech, appearance, spirituality, and other behaviors. On the left, you can see a group of Apache children from Arizona, Chiricahua, who, as they arrived at a boarding school. And on the right, that same group of students, look how different they look now, after they've had their hair chopped off without their consent and dressed in 19th century military clothes. These boarding schools were all across the country. There were more than 400 schools nationwide, but Arizona was home to 47 of them. Almost 50 of these schools existed in Arizona Territory. This included Phoenix Indian School, which, you guessed it, was built on today's Indian School Road. It was one of the longest surviving schools, which actually housed and taught Native children from 1861 to 1990. Some of you were just recently born when that school closed. Your parents might have gone there. Your grandparents might have gone there in terms of age. Children who were far away from their families faced abuse and violence, but they also resisted and built their own communities around sports and music and art, and also covertly still using their own native language. Unfortunately, it is estimated that hundreds of Native children across the country died in these schools, and their families may never have known what really happened to them. In fact, a recent federal report cited over 50 burial sites at or among the various school locations with unmarked graves. So one researcher said, quote, after generations, we still do not know how many children attended or how many children died, or how many children were permanently scarred for life because of these federal institutions. So if you're interested in looking into territorial politics around Native people, you could look at life for Native students in an Indian boarding school in Arizona. And then finally, let's talk about the Yuma Territorial Prison. Now, I don't have a story for you on this one, but basically the Territorial Prison was authorized in 1875, and it actually was one of the most sort of innovative and high-tech locations in the Southwest. And it was within 20 years or so sort of defunct. So it's like kind of a fascinating story. It was built in 1876. And the first there were 7 inmates were moved into the facility in July. So imagine Yuma, right? A prisoner without air conditioning in July, moving into this place of incarceration. The prison held famous law violators, including the legendary stagecoach robber Pearl Hart. You could look into her. And the prison continued in operation for 33 years. So about 30 years, my bad. Due to overcrowding, etc., inmates were ultimately led to a new facility in Florence, Arizona. So back to Phoenix, Brad Luckingham, who wrote on Phoenix in the 70s and 80s, he said Phoenix officials sought to, quote, eliminate all sorts of nuisances and establish more control over what they called half-naked Indians who disgrace our streets, bringing blush to the cheeks of our mothers, sisters, and wives, and more control over opium dens and brothels, which are corrupting our youth. Now, that is a quote from a quote. So he quoted a newspaper, and this is in his book, which was written in 1989. The reason I bring this up is as we move on from the rest of today's lecture, we're going to look specifically at how Phoenix's kind of racist policies led this new territorial capital to design and designate spaces that were for whites and for anybody who wasn't white. And a lot of this was based on hatred and racism, etc. So foundations for contemporary Arizona. As we get to this end of this lecture and the next coming lectures, we're really looking at how history has shaped our current reality. So the first is whites created South Phoenix. This is a picture from 1887. Well, this isn't from 1887. This is from 1911, I believe, maybe 1910 or 19. That wouldn't be right. 1911 is not right. Let me look. This would have been from probably a little bit before 1920. Anyway, these are the railroad tracks. And in 1887, the railroad arrives in Phoenix. So it hadn't existed. There was no way to get on rail into Phoenix. There were no highways, obviously. It was all like horse and buggy, or some boats could navigate the salt rivers. Basically, whites become very concerned about the arrival of Mexican laborers and Mexican residents who, and in some cases, African Americans coming from the South, who wanted additional working opportunities in places like Phoenix. So they write the first housing restrictions in the 1880s that limit anyone of color, Native American, Asian American, African American, Mexican American. They cannot live north of the railroad tracks, and only whites can live north of the railroad tracks. Everyone else is relegated to the south. So as a result, you begin to see the formation of historic neighborhoods and barrios that are south of the tracks or nearby. This is a picture of one of the best known barrios of the Phoenix area, which was razed in the 1970s, razed meaning bulldozed. The only thing remaining from this settlement is the Sacred Heart Church, which was built by hand by Mexican residents at the time. And this is Sacred Heart. It's right on 16th Street and right around I think Washington. So if you were to drive Washington or Jefferson and 16th Street, you'll see this just like open field where houses once were and people once lived. And there were all sorts of these neighborhoods, right, that were African American or Mexican American that were forming around downtown, but were removed from the white power centers. And they lacked things like sewage, sidewalks, paved roads, but they nonetheless had vibrant communities. And we will look into those more as we get closer. This will set the stage for some of your research later this semester. Now, another thing I want to talk about is Teddy Roosevelt. So Arizona is still a territory, right? Arizona's not a state till 1912. Well, Teddy Roosevelt becomes the president in the early 20th century. And until 1912, the Salt River was this wild, untamed force of nature. And then enter President Teddy Roosevelt, a conservation president who was intent on establishing federal oversight of Western lands and waters. Arizona is a perfect candidate. So the Salt River becomes this prime target for the Western-loving president to try out his newly minted, which he had just launched, Bureau of Reclamation in 1902. So just about 9 years later in 1911, Roosevelt initiates a dam of the Salt River, which is called the Roosevelt Dam, right? Up the Salt River between Phoenix and kind of Payson, that area. And part of that project was he had the Center Street Bridge built. Now, you know Central Avenue. If you were to go north to Phoenix from South Phoenix, you would cross Central Avenue. But at the time, it was called Center Street. And if you lived south of the river, which many people did because they weren't allowed to live north, right, as we just talked about, you had to cross the Salt River by horse, maybe by car. You'd have to go across it on a dry day when the river wasn't running. Or you would take this like really rickety old bridge, or you would take a bridge over through like Tempe. Well, in 1911, Teddy Roosevelt had the Center Street Bridge built as part of the Salt River Project. So you might wonder, for example, if you went to school in South Phoenix, why in the world was your school district called the Roosevelt School District? It's named for Teddy Roosevelt because he initiated the Roosevelt Dam, which dammed the Salt River, as well as the Center Street Bridge, which allowed access into and out of South Phoenix. Okay, how do we get to statehood? How in the world does Arizona become a state? You're probably exhausted. You're like, okay, Dr. C, I get it. Like I said, long lecture, take breaks. Let's talk about how Arizona becomes a state. There's a couple different ways. The first is the 5 C's. So all the while, as Arizona is courting sort of separate territorial status from New Mexico and eventually statehood throughout the 1860s, they're marketing themselves using the 5 C's. Have you ever heard of the 5 C's? They are cotton, let me use my cotton, copper, citrus, cattle, and climate. So these are the 5 things that the territory of Arizona and the territorial legislatures and boosters believed could attract federal support of Arizona because all of these things can make money, right? All of these things can be exported or imported in one way or another. And you've got all kinds of attractions. Cotton is experiencing a huge boom in the early 1900s because of war efforts, because of growth, because of the cotton gin and fabric textile creation in the Northeast. You've got copper, which is helping with electricity, and it's also a form of money. You've got citrus, which is food, cattle, which is food, and climate, which this is kind of a weird aspect of Arizona history, but it's health seekers, people who are struggling with like tuberculosis or other kinds of ailments. They're attracted to Arizona because we have arid, non-humid temperatures. And yes, it's hot, but during like 9 months of the year, it's actually relevantly comfortable at the time. So Arizona's kind of relatively mild winters help to attract new residents, but all of these other exports attracted federal support of potentially naming it a state. So Arizona ultimately becomes a state on February 14th, 1912. And statehood was delayed for several reasons. There's 3 or 4 I want to highlight. So Arizona and New Mexico were silver producing states in contrast to the federal gold standards. Liberal and conservative politics in the territory contrasted with federal politics. So remember that kind of north-south tension that continues through the 19th century. There's also racism, right? There just weren't enough white men living in Arizona to appease or interest the federal government. They were concerned that the number of people living in Arizona were either half or more people who were not white and were not men. This causes a real issue. There's a lot of disdain for the territory at the time. And then finally, promotion of Arizona as like this Wild West place. It's just not suitable for Eastern society, Eastern cultures and tendencies. So they take many attempts at statehood. In 1872, it's a no, due to too many indigenous people counted in the census. The second attempt is in 1886, when both New Mexico and Arizona were denied due to lack of gold resources because Arizona had too much copper and silver, not enough gold. But the rhetoric actually shifts under Teddy Roosevelt. You remember how I said that he was like kind of a Western loving guy, and his expansion projects and Bureau of Reclamation projects sort of started to endear people to the idea of Arizona. And then the last thing Arizona does to really get federal support is they grant suffrage for white women. Now, if you're a history buff, you might know universal suffrage was granted to women in 1920. 1912 is when Arizona granted votes for women. This is because they wanted to be able to prove that they had enough white voters, men and women, to appease the federal government's census requirements. So it's a progressive move, but for kind of a concerning rationale or reason. So how does it happen? Arizona statehood, how do we get there? I've told you a lot about life in the territory. How do we get to actual statehood? Here's what's interesting about Arizona. The Arizona Constitution is 4 times longer than the United States Constitution. It is more than twice the length of typical guidelines, and it has been amended over 150 times. They had such a hard time proving that Arizona should be a state. What happens is Taft, the president at the time, this is 1912, vetoed the Arizona Constitution specifically because in the Constitution, there was this one provision about how Arizona could recall its judges. It's this one rule in that huge long document I just told you about. So what Arizonans did was they just removed that provision and reapplied. Well, Taft signs a proclamation recognizing Arizona as the 48th state in 1912. It's the last in the US continental. Alaska and Hawaii are the only 2 remaining. This is on February 14th, 1912. The US Constitution and the 10th Amendment allow for states to reserve all authority that is not assigned to the federal government. Therefore, it was not a surprise when Arizonans removed that constitutional amendment about recalling judges. So they changed it for Taft's approval. But then when he gave them statehood, they just changed it back because they had the autonomy to do so. And why this date? Why February 14th? Well, the belief is that Arizona was scheduled to become a state on February 12th, but that was a national holiday because it was Lincoln's birthday at the time. We didn't have President's Day yet. It was Lincoln's birthday. And President Taft was out of the office. Then they thought the 13th was an unlucky day. They didn't want their statehood to be on the 13th, so they vied for the 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Okay, back to your challenge. First, select one of those many topics I talked about under Arizona territory. Nothing with Mexican period, only Arizona territory. And these are some examples on the left, but you can also choose your own. Then you're going to conduct an image search on Arizona Memory Project for a relevant photograph of your selected topic. And when ready, you'll share your photos with the class addressing these questions. Embed the photo. Do not attach a file. Embed it so we can scroll through and see it. We don't have to download your link. Okay, embed, embed, embed. What is the full citation? Title, author, date, and link. What is portrayed in the photo that represents something you learned about in the lecture or reading about Territorial Arizona? And what can this tell us about life in Arizona? Here's some hints, just a couple things to get you started. Modern photography was not widely used until the 20th century. So some of the photos you select may have been taken years after statehood, and that is okay. So you may find a photo from 1970, but it still references, for example, this is 1980. That's still of the territorial prison. As long as it's relevant, your photo must be an image, not a document, not an audio, not a video file. It must be relevant to the territorial history of Arizona and be unique. Don't select a photo someone else already picked. Priority goes to the person who posted first. So scroll through the discussion board, make sure you don't pick the same picture, and go from there. Now, before I show you how to do your challenge, this is just a great example of all the things I need in your citations. Author, I have in orange. Title, I have in gray. Location, for you, it's going to be a link like it is here, blue. And date is in green. So you need all 4 of those pieces in order to pass this challenge. Let's go back, and I'm going to show you how to access the Arizona Memory Project. The link is in your challenge. This is the Arizona Memory Project. It's maintained by the Secretary of State, and it is a massive online database of digital images. So let's say you click search, and you're interested in I did territorial prison. So let's look up Yuma Territorial Prison. Now you can just start to scroll. Here's the picture I picked. I intentionally just selected the first one. You can click on it. And here's where all that information is going to be. The date, the contributing institution can be your author. The location is the link. Do you see what I'm doing here? Now, let's say you can tell, right, that these are images. You can just see, but this is a document. See how it says format document? I don't want documents. I don't want audio files. The other thing you can do is you can search for, let's see, format right here. Click format and only click image. You can also filter your results that way. So click around, find something. We're going to use the Arizona Memory Project later in this class, but for now, this is your challenge. Oh, let's look at this one. People wearing territorial costumes at the Yuma Territorial Prison. Very cool. All right, that's your challenge. I wish you all the best. Thank you for hanging in with me. I know this was a really long lecture. Hopefully you were able to take breaks, and I look forward to seeing the photos you share. Bye, everybody.